I never thought the coldest night of my life would begin with my daughter-in-law closing the front door behind me while snow fell harder than I had seen in years. The wind cut across the driveway like a blade, and I stood there for a moment, staring at the porch light that used to feel like home. My suitcase landed softly in the snow beside my feet, the wheels leaving crooked lines across the white ground. Brittany folded her arms, her breath visible in the freezing air. "You can't stay here anymore, Margaret," she said, her voice calm in a way that made the words feel even heavier. "This house is for real family." For a second I thought my son would say something. Daniel stood just inside the doorway, one hand resting on the doorframe, the warm light from the hallway behind him. But he didn't step forward. He didn't argue. He didn't even look me in the eye. The door closed slowly after that, with a quiet click that seemed louder than the wind howling across the street. I picked up my suitcase and stepped away from the porch, my boots sinking into several inches of fresh snow. The weather report had said the temperature would drop below 20 degrees that night, the kind of cold that crept through every layer of clothing and settled deep in your bones. At 67 years old, I never imagined I would be walking down a dark suburban street alone in the middle of a snowstorm. Yet there I was, pulling a suitcase behind me that I had packed only an hour earlier while Brittany watched from the kitchen counter. The wheels struggled in the snow, scraping and sticking every few feet. My gloves were thin, and my fingers began to ache almost immediately. Still, I kept walking. The neighborhood looked different at night, quieter than usual, the houses dark and silent under thick blankets of snow. Christmas lights still hung from some of the rooftops, glowing faintly through the storm, and for a moment I remembered a winter long ago when Daniel was 8 years old and insisted we decorate the entire front yard with red and green lights. He had stood beside me in the cold, holding a ladder while I clipped strings of lights along the gutter. Back then, he used to worry if I was cold. Back then. He used to hold my hand when we crossed the street. I pulled my coat tighter around me and kept moving. The wind picked up as I reached the corner of Maple Street, blowing snow across the pavement in small drifting waves. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I only knew that standing outside that house any longer would have been worse. My breath came out in short white clouds as I walked. The streetlights flickered slightly through the falling snow, casting pale circles of light along the road. A few cars passed earlier in the evening, but now the road was empty. The town seemed to have gone to sleep hours ago. I had lived in this area for almost 30 years, yet that night it felt unfamiliar, as if the snowstorm had erased the map of the life I thought I understood. My mind kept returning to the same quiet question: when had everything changed? Daniel used to call me every Sunday afternoon. After he married Brittany, the calls slowly became less frequent. First once a month. Then holidays. Then sometimes only when he needed something. I had tried not to notice. Mothers learn how to pretend things are normal even when they aren't. Another gust of wind blew snow across my path, and I stopped for a moment to steady the suitcase. My cheeks burned from the cold. The sidewalks had disappeared under the snow, forcing me to walk along the edge of the road. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the low rumble of a car engine. Headlights appeared through the falling snow ahead of me, moving slowly down the street. The vehicle passed without stopping, its tires crunching softly over the icy pavement. For a few seconds the headlights illuminated the drifting snow around me, turning the storm into thousands of glowing white specks swirling through the darkness. Then the car disappeared around the corner, leaving the road silent again. I checked my watch. It was just past 9 o'clock. Most people were already inside their homes, sitting near warm fireplaces or watching television with their families. I continued walking until I reached the edge of town where the houses grew farther apart and the road curved toward the highway. That was when I noticed a pair of headlights parked along the shoulder ahead. A dark sedan sat half buried in snow, its hazard lights blinking slowly in the storm. I hesitated for a moment before approaching. The driver's door was open, and a man stood near the front of the car, leaning over the wheel well. Even through the snow I could see he was struggling with something near the tire. The wind carried his frustrated sigh across the road. I walked closer, the snow crunching beneath my boots. As I reached the side of the car, the man straightened up and brushed snow from his coat. He looked to be around my age, maybe a little older, his hair silver at the temples and his posture slightly stiff from the cold. The front tire had clearly gone flat. "Looks like you picked a rough night for car trouble," I said gently. My voice surprised both of us. The man turned toward me, clearly not expecting to see anyone walking along the road during a snowstorm. For a moment he just stared, as if trying to place a memory that hadn't fully formed yet. "I guess I did," he replied with a tired smile. "I thought I could make it home before the storm got worse." The wind whipped snow across the hood of the car again, and I glanced down at the spare tire resting awkwardly beside the trunk. "Do you need a hand?" I asked. He laughed quietly. "I wouldn't want you standing out here in this weather." I shrugged and stepped closer to the car. "I've already been walking in it," I said. "Might as well be useful." Together we knelt beside the tire, brushing snow away from the lug nuts while the hazard lights blinked steadily behind us. The cold metal tools were stiff in my gloved hands, but after a few minutes the tire finally loosened. The man worked carefully, lifting the spare into place while I steadied the jack. The wind howled across the open road, but somehow the small circle of light from the car headlights made the moment feel strangely calm. When the final lug nut tightened into place, the man stood up and wiped his hands on a cloth from the trunk. "Well," he said, letting out a breath of relief, "I owe you my thanks. Not many people would stop on a night like this." I stood up slowly, brushing snow from my coat. "Sometimes people just need a little help," I replied. He nodded, then looked at me again, his eyes narrowing slightly as if studying a familiar photograph from years ago. For a long moment he didn't speak. The snow continued to fall quietly around us. Finally he tilted his head and said something that made my heart pause for just a second. "Margaret," he said slowly. "Is that really you?" The man's voice hung in the air for a moment, almost swallowed by the wind and the steady whisper of falling snow. I froze beside the car, my gloved hands still resting on the cold metal of the hood. The name sounded familiar when he said it, not because it was mine, but because of the way he said it. Carefully. As if it carried memories attached to it. I looked at his face again, really looked this time. The headlights cast a pale glow across his features, highlighting the silver strands in his hair and the deep lines around his eyes. He studied me with the same quiet intensity, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. For several seconds neither of us spoke. My mind searched through years of memories like pages turning too quickly in an old book. The snow continued to fall softly around us, settling on his coat and the shoulders of mine. Then something in his expression shifted, and suddenly I saw it. Not the older man standing beside the car, but the boy he had once been. Tall, slightly awkward, with a gentle smile that used to make my heart race when I was 17 years old. "Thomas?" I said slowly, my voice almost lost in the wind. His face broke into a look of stunned recognition, and he let out a quiet breath that turned into a small laugh of disbelief. "I cannot believe it," he said. "Margaret Collins." Hearing my full name spoken that way sent a strange warmth through me that had nothing to do with the winter coat wrapped around my shoulders. For a moment the cold seemed to fade, replaced by the distant echo of another winter decades earlier. A small-town football game under bright stadium lights. Hot chocolate in paper cups. And a boy named Thomas Walker who used to wait for me by the school parking lot after class. The two of us stood there in the snowstorm, staring at each other like travelers who had unexpectedly crossed paths after a lifetime apart. Thomas shook his head slowly, as if trying to convince himself that the moment was real. "I thought I was imagining things when you walked up," he said. "You look different, of course, but there was something about the way you spoke. I kept thinking it sounded familiar." I smiled faintly. "I was thinking the same thing when you said my name." He looked down at the tire for a second, then back up at me. "I have not seen you in over 50 years. The number sounded unbelievable when he said it out loud, yet I knew it was true. 50 years had passed since the last time we stood face to face. 50 years since we had said goodbye in the parking lot behind our high school gymnasium on a warm spring evening. Life had taken us in different directions after that. College for him. Marriage for me. Careers. Children. Responsibilities that slowly filled every empty space where old memories once lived. I folded my arms against the cold and looked down the quiet road for a moment. Time moves faster than we expect, I said quietly. Thomas nodded. The blinking hazard lights reflected in the snow between us, casting soft red flashes across the pavement. I remember you used to say that you wanted to travel someday, he said. You had that big map in your bedroom with pins stuck in all the places you wanted to see. I laughed softly. You remember that? Of course I do, he said. You talked about it every afternoon when we walked home from school. The memory came back clearly now. The narrow sidewalk behind the school building. The two of us walking slowly so the conversation would last longer. I had forgotten how easily Thomas remembered small details like that. For a moment neither of us spoke again. The storm had grown heavier, and the snow now covered the ground in thick white layers that stretched across the quiet highway. Thomas glanced at my suitcase resting a few feet away beside the road. His eyes moved from the suitcase to my face, and I could see the question forming before he asked it. Margaret, he said gently, what are you doing walking out here in the middle of a snowstorm? I hesitated. The honest answer felt heavier than the suitcase. Lying in the snow beside us. I had not planned to explain my situation to anyone that night, least of all someone from my past. But Thomas had always been the kind of person who waited patiently for the truth rather than forcing it out of someone. The wind pushed another wave of snow across the road, and I watched it drift past the headlights before finally speaking. I was staying with my son, I said. Thomas nodded slowly. Daniel? I looked up in surprise. You remember his name? You wrote it in one of your letters, he said quietly. A long time ago. I had forgotten about those letters. After Thomas left for college, we had written to each other for nearly a year. Long handwritten pages filled with stories about classes, new friends, and the strange excitement of growing up. Eventually the letters became less frequent. Life had a way of changing priorities without asking permission first. Yes, I said softly. Daniel. Thomas waited, sensing there was more to the story. I looked back toward the direction of the neighborhood I had left behind. The porch light of that house was far out of sight now, hidden by distance and falling snow. Tonight did not go the way I expected, I said carefully. Thomas studied my face for a moment before glancing again at the suitcase beside the road. His expression softened with quiet understanding. He did not ask more questions. He did not need to. Instead he stepped around the front of the car and opened the passenger door. Warm air from the heater drifted out into the cold night. Margaret, he said gently, you should not be standing out here in weather like this. I hesitated again, looking at the open car door, then back at him. I do not want to be a burden, I said. Thomas shook his head immediately. Helping someone stay warm during a snowstorm is not a burden, he replied with a calm smile. Especially when that someone once helped me pass algebra. I laughed softly despite myself. I remember that. Then you know I still owe you a favor, he said. The wind gusted across the road again, carrying a swirl of snow between us. I looked down at my suitcase, then back at the car, and finally at Thomas. 50 years had passed since we last spoke, yet something about the moment felt strangely familiar. Like stepping into a memory that had been waiting quietly for decades. Without another word, I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the open passenger door. The passenger door closed with a soft thud behind me, sealing out the wind and the sharp bite of the storm. Warm air from the heater slowly spread through the car, and for the first time that night I felt the stiffness in my fingers begin to fade. Snow continued to tap lightly against the windshield as Thomas walked around the front of the car and climbed into the driver's seat. He brushed snow from his coat and adjusted the heater dial before glancing over at me with a quiet smile that felt both familiar and strangely new after so many years. The interior of the car smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the kind of scent that suggested long drives and quiet mornings. For a moment neither of us spoke. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in steady rhythm, pushing away the growing layer of snow. Thomas finally placed the car into gear and eased the vehicle back onto the road. The tires crunched softly against the icy pavement as we began moving through the quiet highway. I held my gloved hands near the heater vents and watched the snow-covered landscape pass slowly outside the window. The road stretched ahead like a pale ribbon disappearing into the falling snow. Thomas glanced at me again after a few minutes. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Thank you." My voice sounded calmer now that the cold had begun to leave my bones. He nodded and kept his eyes on the road, driving carefully through the storm. The headlights cut through the snow in wide beams of pale light, revealing empty fields and distant barns half buried beneath white drifts. "I still cannot believe I ran into you tonight," he said quietly after a while. "Of all the roads in this state." I smiled faintly. Life has a strange sense of timing sometimes. He laughed softly. "That it does." The car continued forward at a steady pace, the warmth inside slowly replacing the tension that had followed me since leaving Daniel's house. For several miles we simply drove in silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the steady sweep of the windshield wipers. Eventually the lights of a small town appeared ahead, glowing softly through the snowstorm. Thomas slowed as we entered the main street, passing a row of quiet storefronts with darkened windows and snow piled along the sidewalks. A diner near the corner remained open, its neon sign flickering faintly above the entrance. The warm yellow glow from inside spilled onto the snow-covered parking lot. Thomas turned into the lot and parked near the front door. "You should have something warm to drink," he said. "The roads will be easier once the snowplows come through." I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The idea of sitting somewhere warm sounded like the first sensible thing that had happened all evening. We stepped out of the car together, the cold air rushing back around us as we hurried toward the entrance. The bell above the diner door rang softly as we stepped inside. The warmth of the room wrapped around us instantly, carrying the comforting smell of coffee and freshly baked bread. A waitress behind the counter looked up and greeted us with a friendly smile. "Cold night out there," she said. "Coldest one so far this winter," Thomas replied as we slid into a booth near the window. I placed my gloves on the table and looked around the diner. The room was quiet except for a truck driver sitting near the counter and a radio playing softly somewhere in the kitchen. Outside the window, snow continued to fall steadily under the streetlights. The waitress returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee and a small pitcher of cream. "You folks staying warm tonight," she said cheerfully before returning to the counter. I wrapped my hands around the mug and felt the warmth spread through my fingers. The heat rose gently against my face as I took a small sip. For a few seconds I simply sat there, breathing in the warmth and quiet of the diner. Thomas leaned back in the booth and studied me with the same thoughtful expression he had worn earlier by the roadside. "Margaret," he said gently, "it really has been a lifetime." I nodded slowly. "It feels that way." He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up at me. "After I left for college, I tried to find you again a few years later. I came back to town one summer and asked around, but someone told me you had moved away after getting married." I smiled softly. "I did move. Daniel's father got a job in another state." Thomas nodded. "I always wondered how your life turned out." I looked down into my coffee cup, watching the thin spiral of steam rise into the warm air. "It turned out the way most lives do," I said quietly. "Full of plans that change along the way." Thomas did not interrupt. He simply listened the way he always had when we were young. After a moment he said, "And tonight?" I glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall outside the diner lights. The storm no longer felt quite as heavy as it had earlier. Perhaps because the warmth of the diner made it seem farther away. "Tonight was unexpected," I said. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding more from the quiet spaces between my words than from the words themselves. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully and then leaned forward slightly. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but serious, "I hope you do not mind me asking something." I looked up. What is it? He hesitated for a brief second, then said, Is Daniel still living in Cedar Ridge? The question caught me slightly off guard. Yes, I replied. Why? Thomas smiled faintly and leaned back in the booth again. Because I have been doing business in that area for several years now, he said. My company owns a distribution center just outside town. I blinked in surprise. You run a company? Thomas laughed quietly. That sounds more impressive than it really is. It started as a small trucking operation after college. Over time it grew into something larger. I studied his face for a moment, realizing how little I truly knew about the life he had lived over the past 50 years. And what does your company do now? I asked. Logistics and freight transportation mostly, he replied. Warehouses, shipping routes, contracts with manufacturers. I nodded slowly. Something about the way he mentioned Cedar Ridge stirred a small memory in the back of my mind. Daniel works for a company that handles warehouse distribution, I said carefully. Thomas's expression changed slightly, not in a dramatic way, but just enough to suggest recognition. Does he now? He said quietly. The words were simple, but there was a thoughtful pause behind them that made me look at him more closely. Why do you ask? I said. Thomas lifted his coffee mug and took a slow sip before answering. When he set the mug back on the table, his eyes met mine again with calm curiosity. Because I believe, he said gently, that my company might be doing business with your son. Thomas's words lingered in the quiet space between us, mixing with the soft hum of the diner's refrigerator and the faint sound of the storm outside. For a moment I simply stared at him, trying to understand the coincidence unfolding in front of me. 50 years had already felt unbelievable. Now the idea that our lives might be connected again through something as ordinary as business made the night feel even stranger. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and felt the warmth settle into my palms. Your company works with Daniel? I asked slowly. Thomas nodded once, his expression thoughtful. It might, he said carefully. Cedar Ridge has a distribution contract with a logistics firm that handles several warehouse locations. I do not manage every contract personally, but the name Collins sounds familiar. I looked down at the table, watching a small drop of coffee slide along the edge of my mug. Daniel had talked about work many times over the years, but I had never paid much attention to the details. When children grow older, their careers often become complicated webs of companies and partnerships that parents only hear about in passing conversations. He mentioned something about distribution management, I said quietly. But I never asked too many questions. Thomas leaned back slightly in the booth, considering the thought. The company I am thinking of recently started negotiating a larger contract with our warehouse network, he said. It has been a complicated process. I looked up at him again. Complicated how? Thomas gave a small thoughtful smile. Business negotiations always are, he replied. But sometimes there are details that need clarification. He did not elaborate further, and I sensed that he was choosing his words carefully. The waitress passed by our table again and refilled our coffee cups. Outside the diner window the snowstorm continued, the flakes drifting through the glow of the streetlights like tiny white feathers. The warmth of the diner made the storm feel distant now, as if the events of the evening had happened hours earlier, instead of only a short time ago. Thomas stirred his coffee slowly before speaking again. Margaret, he said gently, may I ask you something else? I nodded. Of course. He hesitated just long enough to show that the question mattered to him. How long have you been staying with Daniel? I thought for a moment before answering. About 6 months, I said. After my husband passed away last year, it seemed like the practical thing to do. Thomas's eyes softened with sympathy. I am sorry to hear that. I gave a small nod. Thank you. His name was Robert. Saying my husband's name out loud felt both familiar and distant at the same time, like remembering a house that no longer stands. Robert and I had shared more than 40 years of marriage, raising Daniel together and building a life that once felt stable and predictable. When Robert died suddenly from a heart condition, everything shifted. The house became quiet in ways I had never experienced before. The empty rooms felt larger. The evenings felt longer. Eventually Daniel suggested that I move in with him and Brittany. At the time it sounded like the right decision. It must have been difficult adjusting, Thomas said softly. It was, I admitted. But I believed families should support each other. I paused for a moment, remembering the early weeks after moving into Daniel's home. Brittany had been polite then, though distant. The house itself was large and modern, with wide windows and polished floors that never seemed to show a single speck of dust. Everything about it felt carefully arranged. At first I tried to stay out of the way. I cooked meals occasionally, folded laundry when Brittany left it in the basket, and spent most afternoons reading near the living room window. Did Daniel invite you to live with them? Thomas asked. Yes, I replied. He said it would be easier for everyone. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. And Brittany? I gave a quiet sigh before answering. She agreed, I said. At least in the beginning. The words hung in the air between us. Thomas did not press further. Instead he watched the snow falling outside the window for a moment before speaking again. Sometimes families change in ways we do not expect, he said gently. I looked at him and managed a faint smile. That is one way to describe it. The truck driver at the counter finished his meal and left the diner, the bell above the door ringing softly as he stepped back into the storm. The diner grew even quieter after that. Thomas turned his attention back to me. Margaret, he said carefully, earlier tonight when I saw your suitcase beside the road, it looked like you had left in a hurry. I hesitated. The memory of Brittany standing in the doorway returned to my mind, along with the sound of the door closing behind me. Even now the moment felt unreal, like a scene from someone else's life. It was not exactly planned, I said quietly. Thomas studied my face, his expression filled with patient concern rather than curiosity. Did something happen? He asked gently. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. The warmth from the coffee cup had finally returned feeling to my fingers. Outside the snow continued to fall, but inside the diner everything felt still and calm. For the first time since leaving Daniel's house, I allowed myself to think clearly about what had happened. Brittany decided that I should find another place to stay, I said slowly. Thomas's eyebrows lifted slightly. Tonight? I nodded once. Tonight. He leaned back in the booth again, absorbing the information without interrupting. I could see the quiet disbelief in his eyes, but he did not express it aloud. Instead he asked a simple question. Did Daniel agree with her? The question carried more weight than the others. I looked toward the diner window again, watching the snow swirl under the streetlights. After a few seconds I answered softly. He did not stop her. Thomas remained silent for a moment. The ticking clock on the wall behind the counter filled the quiet space of the diner. Finally he said, Margaret, you deserve better than to be walking alone in a snowstorm. I gave a small smile that carried more tiredness than humor. Life rarely asks what we deserve. Thomas studied me thoughtfully, then glanced toward the road outside. The snowplow had begun clearing the main street, pushing thick ridges of snow toward the curb. After watching it pass, he turned back to me again. Margaret, he said gently, where were you planning to go tonight? I opened my mouth to answer but realized that I did not have a clear response. The truth was that I had not planned that far ahead. When someone leaves a house in the middle of a storm, the first instinct is simply to keep moving. I am not sure, I admitted quietly. Thomas looked at me for a long moment, the kind of thoughtful pause that suggested he was considering something important. Then he said something that would quietly change the direction of the entire night. In that case, he said calmly, perhaps we should talk about a better plan. Thomas's words settled gently over the table like the quiet snowfall outside the diner window. For a few seconds I did not answer. I simply watched the snowplow move slowly past the diner, pushing a wide ridge of snow toward the curb. The orange lights on top of the truck flashed steadily through the storm, reflecting off the glass in front of us. A better plan. The phrase sounded simple, yet it carried a weight that I had not allowed myself to consider since leaving Daniel's house. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup again and looked back at Thomas. "I suppose that would be a good idea," I said quietly. He nodded once, as if he had already been thinking several steps ahead. Thomas had always been that way, even when we were teenagers. While I tended to react to things as they happened, he preferred to observe quietly first, then act when he understood the situation clearly. He rested his elbows lightly on the table and spoke in the same calm tone he had used all evening. "Margaret, I have a small guest house on my property just outside town," he said. "It used to belong to my parents. I had it renovated a few years ago." I blinked in mild surprise. "A guest house?" He smiled slightly. "Yes. It is simple, but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fireplace that works better than most modern heaters." The thought of a fireplace instantly brought to mind a warm living room with soft light and quiet evenings, a sharp contrast to the freezing wind that had followed me down the road earlier. "I could not impose on you like that," I said gently. Thomas shook his head immediately. "You would not be imposing," he replied. "The house is empty most of the time. My daughter visits occasionally when she brings the grandchildren, but otherwise it simply sits there." I studied his face for a moment, searching for any sign that the offer was made out of obligation rather than sincerity. I found none. His expression remained steady and open, the same quiet kindness I remembered from years ago. "You are very generous," I said slowly. "But I would not want to complicate your life." Thomas gave a small laugh. "Margaret, my life has survived freight contracts, shipping delays, and 3 decades of running a logistics company. I believe it can survive offering a warm place to stay during a snowstorm." I could not help smiling at that. Outside the diner window the storm seemed to be easing slightly. The snowplow had already cleared most of the main street, leaving dark tracks of wet pavement behind. A few cars began moving slowly through town again. The world outside was beginning to wake up from the storm. Inside the diner, the clock above the counter ticked quietly toward 10 o'clock. I took another sip of coffee and thought about everything that had happened in the past few hours. The evening had started in a warm kitchen where I believed I still had a place in my son's home. It had turned into a lonely walk through a freezing snowstorm. Now I was sitting across from someone I had not seen in 50 years, discussing where I might sleep that night. Life had a strange way of rearranging its pieces without warning. "How far outside town is your property?" I asked finally. Thomas leaned back slightly in the booth. "About 15 minutes by car," he said. "It is near the old Walker family orchard." The name stirred another memory. "The orchard with the red barn?" I asked. His face lit up with quiet amusement. "The very same." I laughed softly. "You used to sneak apples from those trees during the fall." "Sneak," he said with mock offense. "Margaret, my family owned the orchard." "That did not stop your father from scolding you when he caught us climbing the fence," I replied. Thomas chuckled at the memory, and for a moment the years between us seemed to disappear. The conversation felt easy in a way that reminded me of our walks home from school long ago. Eventually the laughter faded, and the quiet returned. Thomas glanced toward my suitcase resting beside the booth. "You are welcome to stay there as long as you need," he said gently. "Until you decide what you want to do next." The offer was simple, yet it carried an unexpected sense of stability. I had spent the last few hours feeling as though the ground beneath my life had shifted without warning. Now someone was offering a place where I could pause and think clearly again. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "That means more than you realize." Thomas nodded, accepting the gratitude without making a larger moment of it. After a brief pause he added, "There is something else we should discuss as well." I looked at him curiously. "What is that?" He rested his hands on the table and spoke carefully. "Earlier we were talking about Daniel and the distribution company he works with." I nodded. "Yes. Thomas glanced toward the diner window again before continuing. The reason I asked about Cedar Ridge is because my company has been reviewing several contract proposals from that region. And Daniel's company is involved? I asked. Thomas gave a slow nod. It appears so. Something about his tone suggested that the situation was not entirely straightforward. Is there a problem with the contract? I asked quietly. Thomas considered the question for a moment before answering. Let us say there are some details that have raised concerns, he said. I felt a small knot of uncertainty tighten in my chest. What kind of concerns? Thomas spoke calmly, choosing his words with care. The proposal includes the potential sale of several properties connected to the distribution network. One of those properties is a residential address associated with the Collins family. I stared at him, trying to process the meaning behind the words. A residential address? I repeated slowly. Thomas met my eyes and spoke gently. Margaret, the paperwork I reviewed earlier this week listed a house in Cedar Ridge that may be scheduled for transfer as part of the deal. I felt the warmth of the diner fade slightly around me. Daniel mentioned something about financial planning recently, I said quietly. But he never explained the details. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That is why I believe we should look into the situation more carefully, he said. Because if the property listed in that contract is the house where you have been living, then the decision to send you away tonight may not have been a coincidence at all. Thomas's final sentence lingered in the warm air of the diner long after he finished speaking. For several seconds I simply stared at him, trying to understand what he was suggesting without saying it outright. Outside the window the storm had softened into a steady fall of quiet snow, but inside my thoughts a new kind of storm had begun forming. If the house Daniel and Brittany lived in was part of a property transfer, then suddenly the events of the evening looked very different from the way I had first understood them. I looked down at my coffee cup again, noticing that the surface had gone still and dark. You think they asked me to leave because of the house, I said slowly. Thomas did not answer immediately. He rested his hands calmly on the table and considered his response carefully, the way someone does when the truth might carry consequences. I think it is possible, he said finally. But we should not assume anything without understanding the paperwork. I nodded slightly, appreciating the restraint in his words even though the thought itself was unsettling. For months I had believed that the tension between Brittany and me came from simple disagreements about living arrangements. Small things. Different habits. The natural friction that sometimes appears when generations share the same space. Now another possibility was beginning to form quietly beneath those explanations. Daniel never mentioned selling the house, I said after a moment. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Did you ever sign any documents since moving in with them? The question made me pause. I tried to remember the conversations from the past few months. There had been a few moments when Daniel asked me to review financial papers. One afternoon he placed a folder on the kitchen table and explained that he was reorganizing some property records for tax purposes. I remembered skimming through several pages without studying them closely. At the time it had seemed routine. Families often handle paperwork together, especially after the death of a spouse. There were some documents, I said slowly. Daniel said they were related to property taxes and estate planning. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Did you sign them? I searched my memory again. The papers had been filled with small legal language that I did not fully understand. Daniel had pointed to a few lines and said that signing would make it easier to manage the house. Finances. I trusted him. Why would a mother expect otherwise? I signed a few pages, I admitted quietly. Thomas did not react with alarm. Instead he simply folded his hands together on the table and spoke with calm patience. That does not necessarily mean anything serious, he said. But it does mean we should review the documents carefully. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the situation settling into place. The thought that I might have signed something important without fully understanding it made my chest tighten slightly. I feel foolish now, I said softly. Thomas shook his head gently. There is nothing foolish about trusting your family, he replied. Most people would do exactly the same. The kindness in his voice eased some of the tension that had begun building inside me. For a moment we both sat quietly, listening to the faint music playing somewhere behind the diner counter. The clock on the wall now read a few minutes past 10. The waitress wiped down a nearby table and turned off one of the overhead lights, signaling that the night was growing late. Outside, the snowplow had already cleared most of the road, leaving the street calm and nearly empty. Thomas eventually spoke again. "Margaret, tomorrow morning I can contact my legal team and ask them to review the contract proposal that includes the Cedar Ridge property." I looked up at him. "Your legal team?" He gave a modest shrug. "Running a company requires a few lawyers," he said with a small smile. "They specialize in property agreements and contract verification. If there is anything unusual about the paperwork, they will find it quickly." The idea of professionals examining the situation made me feel slightly more secure. For the first time since leaving Daniel's house, the confusion surrounding the evening began to organize itself into something manageable. Questions could be answered. Documents could be reviewed. The truth, whatever it was, would eventually become clear. "Thank you for offering to help," I said sincerely. Thomas waved the gratitude away gently. "It is the least I can do after you helped me change a tire in a snowstorm," he said. I smiled faintly at that. The simplicity of the moment earlier on the roadside felt almost symbolic now. A small act of kindness had unexpectedly opened the door to something far more complicated. Thomas glanced toward the window again, then back at me. "For tonight, the most important thing is that you have a warm place to stay," he said. "We can sort out the rest in the morning." I nodded slowly. The thought of the guest house with the fireplace returned to my mind again. After the emotional chaos of the evening, the image felt like a quiet refuge waiting somewhere beyond the storm. "Your parents' orchard," I said softly, remembering the stories he had mentioned earlier. Thomas smiled. "Yes. The orchard still stands. We no longer harvest apples commercially, but the trees are still there. In the summer it is a peaceful place." I imagined the rows of apple trees covered in blossoms, the scent of fresh fruit drifting through warm air. It seemed like another world compared to the frozen road where we had met only an hour earlier. The waitress returned once more and asked politely if we needed anything else before closing the diner for the night. Thomas paid the bill while I gathered my gloves and coat. When we stepped outside, the storm had almost completely passed. Snow still covered the ground in thick layers, but the wind had faded and the sky above the town had begun to clear. The cold air felt sharper now without the wind, but it no longer carried the same sense of isolation that had followed me down the road earlier. We walked back to the car together, our footsteps crunching softly on the fresh snow. Thomas opened the passenger door for me again, and I settled into the warm seat as he started the engine. The heater quickly filled the car with warmth once more. As we pulled out of the diner parking lot and turned onto the quiet road leading out of town, I watched the snow-covered streets pass slowly outside the window. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay the orchard, the guest house, and perhaps the first calm place I had felt all evening. Yet beneath that quiet hope another thought continued to grow steadily in my mind. If Thomas was right about the property contract connected to Daniel's company, then the events of that evening were not simply a misunderstanding between family members. They might have been the first visible sign of a much larger decision that had been made without my knowledge. The road leading out of town stretched quietly. Ahead of us, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the snow that covered the countryside like a white blanket. The storm had almost completely passed now, leaving the world strangely peaceful after the chaos of the evening. Snow rested on the branches of bare trees, and the fields on both sides of the road looked smooth and untouched under the pale glow of the moon beginning to appear through the clearing clouds. Inside the car the heater hummed softly, and for a moment I allowed myself to simply watch the quiet winter landscape pass by without speaking. Thomas drove carefully along the narrow road, his hands steady on the steering wheel. After several minutes the lights of town disappeared behind us, replaced by long stretches of farmland and scattered houses set far back from the road. I remembered this part of the county from years ago. Many things had changed, but the open fields still carried the same sense of quiet distance from the busy world. Eventually Thomas slowed the car and turned onto a smaller road lined with tall maple trees. Their branches arched overhead like dark outlines against the pale winter sky. The tires crunched gently over packed snow as we followed the winding path deeper into the countryside. "We are almost there," Thomas said calmly. I nodded and looked ahead. A few minutes later a wooden sign appeared beside the road, half covered in snow but still readable under the headlights. Walker Orchard. The name stirred another distant memory from long ago. The road curved once more and then opened into a wide clearing where several buildings stood surrounded by rows of snow-covered apple trees. Even in winter the orchard had a quiet beauty to it. The trees stretched across the property in neat rows, their branches bare but graceful under the soft moonlight. In the distance a large red barn stood beside a cluster of storage buildings. Near the front of the property sat a warm-looking farmhouse with lights glowing in the windows. Thomas guided the car past the farmhouse and toward a smaller building set a short distance away near the edge of the orchard. The structure looked modest but welcoming, with a stone chimney rising along one side and a small porch facing the trees. Snow covered the roof and the wooden railing along the porch steps. Thomas parked the car beside the walkway and turned off the engine. The quiet that followed felt deeper than anything I had heard all evening. No wind. No traffic. Only the soft distant sound of snow settling among the trees. "This is the guest house," Thomas said gently. I stepped out of the car and looked around the property. The cold air was crisp but calm now, and the sky above the orchard had cleared enough to reveal a scattering of stars. The place felt peaceful in a way that immediately eased some of the tension I had been carrying since leaving Daniel's house. Thomas unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Warm air greeted us as soon as we stepped inside. The interior was simple but comfortable. A small living room with wooden floors and soft lamplight welcomed us first. A stone fireplace stood along the far wall, already glowing with a steady fire that Thomas must have prepared earlier that day. The scent of burning oak filled the room with a quiet warmth that made the house feel instantly inviting. A couch sat near the fireplace with a woven blanket folded neatly across the back. A small bookshelf lined the wall beside it, filled with novels and travel books. "I keep the heat running during the winter," Thomas explained as he hung his coat near the door. "That way the place stays ready whenever someone visits." I stepped further into the room, letting the warmth settle around me. The firelight reflected softly across the wooden floor and the stone walls of the fireplace. After the long walk through the snow and the unexpected events of the evening, the simple comfort of the room felt almost unreal. Thomas carried my suitcase inside and set it gently near the couch. "There are 2 bedrooms down the hallway," he said. "You may choose whichever one you prefer." I looked around slowly, taking in the peaceful atmosphere of the house. The quiet of the orchard outside seemed to flow gently through the windows, making the entire space feel calm and safe. "It is beautiful here," I said softly. Thomas smiled with quiet satisfaction. "My parents built the guest house many years ago," he said. "They used it for relatives who visited during harvest season." He walked to the fireplace and added another piece of wood to the fire. The flames brightened slightly, casting a warmer glow across the room. For a moment we both stood there watching the fire settle into its steady rhythm. Eventually Thomas spoke again. "Margaret, you must be exhausted after tonight." I nodded slowly. The events of the evening had been so unexpected that my body was only now beginning to recognize how tired it truly felt. "Yes," I admitted quietly. Thomas gestured toward the hallway. "The bedroom on the left has fresh blankets. You will find everything you need there." I picked up my suitcase and walked down the short hallway. The bedroom he mentioned was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in thick quilts and a small lamp glowing softly on the nightstand. A window beside the bed looked out over the orchard, where rows of apple trees stretched across the snowy field under the quiet moonlight. I placed the suitcase near the bed and stood for a moment looking out the window. The stillness of the orchard felt like a world away from the tense atmosphere I had left behind earlier that night. For the first time since Brittany closed the door behind me, I allowed myself to breathe without feeling the tight knot of uncertainty that had followed me down the road. After a few minutes I returned to the living room where Thomas was pouring 2 glasses of water in the kitchen area. He handed one to me with a gentle smile. "You should try to get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we will begin sorting out the details with the property paperwork." I nodded and took a small sip of water. The calm confidence in his voice made the situation feel less overwhelming. "Thank you again for everything tonight," I said sincerely. Thomas gave a quiet shrug. "Sometimes life brings people back together for a reason," he replied. I looked toward the window again where the moonlight reflected across the snow-covered orchard. His words lingered in my mind as I considered how unlikely the entire evening had been. If Brittany had not told me to leave. If the storm had not forced Thomas to stop with a flat tire on that road. If I had chosen a different path when walking away from the house. None of us would have been sitting here now. Thomas walked to the door and picked up his coat. "I will be in the farmhouse across the orchard," he said. "If you need anything at all, the lights will be on." I thanked him once more as he stepped outside into the quiet winter night. A moment later his footsteps faded across the snow. I closed the door and returned to the living room where the fire continued to burn softly in the stone fireplace. The guest house felt peaceful and warm, yet my thoughts returned to the conversation in the diner earlier that night. The possibility that Daniel and Brittany had been preparing to sell the house without telling me still lingered quietly in my mind. Tomorrow Thomas would contact his legal team and review the contract documents connected to Cedar Ridge. By this time tomorrow evening, we might know the truth behind the decisions that had pushed me out into the snow. I sat down on the couch beside the fire and watched the flames flicker gently against the stone. Outside the orchard remained silent under the moonlight, but deep inside I could feel the first quiet realization beginning to take shape. The night that had started with betrayal might also become the moment when the full truth about my son's plans finally came into the open. I slept more deeply that night than I had expected. Perhaps it was the quiet of the orchard, or the steady warmth of the fireplace that had burned low through the evening. When I opened my eyes the next morning, soft daylight filtered through the window beside the bed, casting pale winter light across the quilt. For a moment I simply lay there, listening to the stillness outside. The storm had passed completely. I rose slowly and walked to the window. The orchard stretched across the property like a calm sea of white, each row of apple trees dusted with fresh snow. Thin sunlight reflected off the branches, making the entire landscape glow softly under the morning sky. The peaceful view felt so different from the cold road where the night had begun that it almost seemed like a memory from another life. After dressing, I walked into the living room where the fireplace had faded into warm embers. A small tray sat on the kitchen counter with fresh coffee and a handwritten note. The handwriting was neat and familiar. "Margaret, I thought you might enjoy breakfast in the farmhouse when you are ready. Take your time. Thomas." I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood near the window for a moment, letting the warmth spread through my hands. Outside, I could see faint footprints in the snow leading from the farmhouse toward the orchard barn. Thomas had clearly been awake for some time already. I finished the coffee and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold but calm, carrying the crisp scent of winter and distant wood smoke. Snow crunched gently under my boots as I walked along the path toward the farmhouse. As I approached, the front door opened and Thomas stepped out with the same quiet smile he had worn the night before. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope you slept well." "Very well," I replied honestly. "It was the first peaceful night I have had in a long time." He nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant. Inside the farmhouse the kitchen smelled of fresh toast and coffee. The space felt welcoming and lived in, with wooden cabinets and large windows that looked out over the orchard fields. We sat at the kitchen table while Thomas poured more coffee. For a few minutes we spoke about simple things. The weather. The orchard. The quiet beauty of the property in winter. It felt natural to begin the day slowly after the unexpected events of the night before. Eventually Thomas glanced toward the folder resting beside him on the table. "I contacted my legal office early this morning," he said calmly. "They began reviewing the Cedar Ridge contract as soon as the documents arrived." My stomach tightened slightly as I listened. And? Thomas opened the folder and looked through several printed pages before speaking again. The situation is more complicated than I expected, he said carefully. He slid one sheet of paper across the table toward me. I looked down at the document, recognizing the address immediately. Daniel's house. My house. The same property where I had lived with Robert for more than 30 years before moving in with Daniel after my husband passed away. This contract proposal includes the transfer of that property as part of a larger distribution expansion, Thomas explained. I stared at the page in silence. The numbers and legal descriptions meant little to me, but the address was unmistakable. But Daniel cannot sell that house without my approval, I said slowly. Thomas nodded. That is exactly what my legal team noticed. He turned another page in the folder and pointed to a section filled with legal language. According to the county property records, the house remains registered under your name. I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Then how could it appear in this contract? I asked. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression serious but calm. Because someone submitted documentation indicating that ownership authorization had been granted. The words made my chest tighten again. Authorization? Thomas nodded. A signed approval allowing the property to be included in a commercial transfer agreement. I felt the memory return immediately. The papers Daniel had asked me to sign at the kitchen table. The folder. The quick explanation about taxes and property planning. The documents I signed, I said quietly. Thomas did not interrupt. Instead he waited patiently while the realization settled into place. I did not know what they were, I continued slowly. Daniel told me they were routine forms. Thomas spoke gently. My legal team believes those signatures may have been used as part of this authorization. The kitchen fell silent for several seconds. Outside the window the orchard looked calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight, yet the situation unfolding inside the farmhouse felt anything but calm. So Daniel and Brittany asked me to leave because they expected the house to be transferred, I said quietly. Thomas nodded once. That appears to be the case. I took a slow breath and looked down at the contract again. For months I had believed the tension in Daniel's home came from ordinary disagreements between family members. Now it seemed the situation had been far more deliberate. Thomas closed the folder and rested his hands calmly on the table. The important thing is that the contract has not been finalized, he said. Which means the authorization can still be challenged. I looked up at him. Challenged how? My legal team is already preparing a formal review request, Thomas explained. If the documents were signed under misleading circumstances, the agreement cannot proceed. The words brought a quiet sense of stability back into the room. The situation was serious, but it was no longer invisible. It could be examined. Questioned. Corrected. Thomas gave a small reassuring smile. You are not alone in this, Margaret, he said gently. I nodded slowly, feeling a calm determination begin to replace the confusion that had followed me since leaving Daniel's house the night before. The betrayal had been painful, but the truth was beginning to surface piece by piece. And for the first time since that door closed behind me in the snow, I realized that the story was not ending with that moment. It was only beginning to reveal what had really been happening all along. The morning light continued to spill across the farmhouse kitchen table as I sat quietly with the documents in front of me. Outside the window the orchard looked calm and peaceful, but inside my mind the pieces of the past few months were slowly rearranging themselves into a clearer picture. For a long time I had tried to explain the tension in Daniel's home as something ordinary. A difference in habits. A crowded house. The natural distance that sometimes appears between generations. But the contract papers resting on the table suggested something far more deliberate. Thomas watched me carefully, giving me the time to absorb everything before speaking again. My legal team will file the review request this afternoon, he said calmly. That will immediately pause the property transfer process until the authorization is examined. I nodded slowly. The situation still felt unreal, but the steady tone in his voice made it easier to focus on the next steps rather than the betrayal itself. Will Daniel know about the review request? I asked. Thomas folded the papers back into the folder before answering. Yes, he said. Once the review is filed, all parties connected to the contract will receive notice. I looked toward the window again, watching a few birds land on the snow-covered branches of the nearest apple tree. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, Daniel and Brittany were likely going about their morning routines without realizing that the plan they had been quietly building might soon be interrupted. The thought did not bring anger the way I might have expected. Instead, it brought a strange sense of calm clarity. The truth had begun to surface, and with it came the understanding that silence would no longer protect anyone involved. Thomas closed the folder and set it aside. Margaret, he said gently, there is something important you should remember. I looked back at him. What is that? You did not do anything wrong by trusting your son, he replied. The responsibility for honesty belongs to the person who asked for your signature. I considered those words carefully. For a moment I thought about Daniel as a small boy again, standing beside me in the yard while we planted flowers in the spring. He used to ask endless questions about how things grew and why the seasons changed. Back then I believed that teaching him kindness and honesty would naturally guide the rest of his life. Somewhere along the years that simple understanding must have become more complicated. Thomas rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out over the rows of apple trees stretching across the property. When my parents built this orchard, he said thoughtfully, they used to say that trees take patience. You plant them knowing that the fruit may not appear for several seasons. I joined him at the window, watching the sunlight brighten the snow across the orchard rows. Families are similar, he continued. We spend years planting values and hoping they grow the way we intended. I nodded quietly. And sometimes they grow differently than we imagined. Thomas smiled gently at that. Yes. But that does not erase the years you spent caring for them. The room grew quiet again as we stood there together. The orchard seemed even more peaceful under the bright winter sky, as if the storm from the night before had never happened. Eventually Thomas checked his watch and gathered the folder of documents. I should contact my legal office again before the afternoon, he said. They will want to confirm a few details before submitting the review request. I thanked him once more, though the words felt small compared to the help he had already offered. He gave a modest nod in response and stepped into the adjoining office room to make the call. While he spoke quietly on the phone, I remained by the window watching the orchard. The snow glistened under the sunlight, and a light breeze moved gently through the branches of the trees. The peaceful scene made it easier to think clearly about the decisions ahead. I realized that the night before had changed more than just my immediate situation. Being asked to leave Daniel's house had forced me to see the truth that had been forming quietly for months. Sometimes distance reveals what closeness tries to hide. After a while Thomas returned from the office. Everything is in motion, he said calmly. The review request will be filed within the hour. I nodded, feeling a quiet determination settle into place inside me. The next steps would likely bring difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths, but avoiding them would only allow the situation to continue unnoticed. Later that afternoon Thomas and I walked together through the orchard paths, the snow crunching beneath our boots as we followed the rows of trees stretching toward the horizon. The winter air felt fresh and steady, and the silence of the orchard allowed space for reflection. At one point Thomas stopped beside an old apple tree with a thick trunk and spreading branches. This tree was planted the year I graduated high school, he said with a small smile. The same year we said goodbye before I left for college. I touched the rough bark lightly with my hand. It has grown well, I said. Yes, he replied. Some things survive the passing of time better than others. We continued walking slowly through the orchard as the afternoon sun moved lower in the sky. The events of the previous night felt distant now, yet the consequences of those events were only beginning to unfold. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge the legal notice would soon arrive, bringing the hidden agreement into the open. Whatever conversations followed would no longer take place behind closed doors or hidden paperwork. As we reached the edge of the orchard path, I paused and looked back across the rows of trees stretching toward the farmhouse. For the first time since being asked to leave my son's home, I felt something stronger than confusion or disappointment. I felt clarity. The snowstorm that had pushed me onto that quiet road had also led me back to someone who offered honesty instead of secrecy. And as the winter sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, I realized that the night I was forced to walk away from one house had quietly guided me toward a place where the truth could finally be faced without fear.